Thank you, Prashant. This is the time where I start with a cliche joke about being picked to do this talk because of my vast and deep experience in failure. No. Seriously, though, in both my professional and personal lives, I've had failures, and I've seen others fail. Failure can be painful, but for me, some of my most important learnings have come through failure. I want to share a couple of those with you today. So, let's start. We talked about this being one part professional, one part personal. We'll start with professional failure that I've experienced personally. So, my first big breakout opportunity in a Fortune 500 company was leading the transfer of a sale of one of the lines of businesses that with an LOB that we had just sold to a new buyer. We sold it for a little under $450 million, and now I had to make sure the buyer got what they paid for. That may sound straightforward, but it's actually really, really complicated. Generally, in a large firm like a Fortune 500 company, all the corporate services are shared across lines of business. Finance and accounting, HR, legal compliance and risk, and certainly IT and technology, all the software, all the data centers. That's one of the ways big companies get a lot of leverage from their size and their scale. But it means that lines of business aren't standalone businesses. You can't just pick them up and move them from the seller to the buyer. You have to untangle the sold line of business from the whole rest of the company while the buyer spools up and creates those capabilities on their own end. So during a transition like that, the seller actually ends up providing a lot of those services to the buyer during that transition period. Data centers are a really common example of that. And so to make that happen, there's a contract for those services called a transitional service agreement, or a TSA. Within those, to make sure the seller isn't leaving the buyer high and dry, there are service level agreements. So very specific things. If for a data center, it's things like uptime and availability, all the sorts of normal business measures you would imagine. For things like HR, it gets a little more complicated. Finance and accounting is a little more straightforward, but there's a whole range of them. With those service level agreements, there are also really stiff financial penalties if the seller doesn't meet those service level agreements. So, for a sense of scale in this particular project, the transitional service agreement fees in their peak were millions of dollars a month, and the service level agreements were 100 pages of legal documents. So what seems like a pretty simple transfer of a business actually ends up being really complicated. But despite the complications, I brought the project in on time and on budget, and we met our service level agreements, and my career seemed to be on its way, and I was feeling over the moon. A couple years later, I had my second big breakout opportunity when we merged with our largest direct competitor. And I was chosen to co-lead that merger integration, basically combining two Fortune 500 companies into one marketplace behemoth. I was thrilled and candidly pretty full of myself. Based on that first breakout project, I figured I got this. You know the feeling when something goes really, really well in your career and you feel like you're almost floating? And you have this combined feeling of invincibility and optimism that kind of makes everything glow. That's kind of how I felt at the time. I mean, you couldn't have wiped the grin off my face if you tried. That didn't last very long. It started to sink in that the scope of this new project was immense. So the first deal I mentioned was around $450 million. The second one was over $16 billion. The first project affected 4,000 employees, mostly in the eastern US. The second one was 40,000 employees across a dozen countries in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. The first deal was a straight-up cash sale to a company that wasn't a direct competitor of ours. The second was a merger of two sometimes bitter rivals. So it wasn't long before those cocky feelings were replaced with a bit of fear, a bit of doubt, and frankly, a bunch of panic. So what happened? As I said, the first project I brought in on time and on budget. Here's a spoiler alert. The second one, not so much. I ended up over budget and late, and not a little bit over budget, like over $100 million over budget, and months late. Yikes, right? Well, I learned from my failures in that first project, and that helped me make the second project a success. I'll say that again. The failures in the first project helped me make the second project a success. It was the first project where I had the failures. How can that be? How can a project that's on budget and on time be a failure compared to a project that's way, way over budget and way late? Well, it's all about having the right longer-term measures of success. Measures based on business outcomes, not budgets and activities. Budgets are inputs. They're not the outcomes you're trying to get. So, yeah, we were over budget and late, but that's because the integration team leaders and I found expense and revenue synergies well beyond the initial plan and the budget. You can think of it this way. Let's say you have a project with a budget of $1,000 and it's planned to deliver an annual return of $500. That's a really good investment. You spend $1,000 today, and every year thereafter you get $500 back. In 2 years you've broken even, and it's pure profit after that, time value of money aside. But suppose as the project progresses, you find out that if you spend $1,100 rather than the budget of $1,000, you can get an annual return of $600. That's a much better investment. As a shareholder, I want you to spend that extra $100 today to keep getting an extra $100 the following years in return. I want you to go over budget because that incremental spend has twice the ROI. So with a business outcomes focused, in that second project, yeah, we were over our budget, but we exceeded our expense synergy goals by over $120 million. Not a bad ROI. So to bring the example to life, I thought I'd go and spend a couple minutes talking about some of the failures in that first project, what I learned from them, and how I applied those learnings in the second project. So let's start with the overall rallying cry for the project. In the first one, it was don't mess up, hit your numbers. That's a really narrow, very inwardly focused kind of rallying cry. Making things worse, the culture I pushed was project success regardless of personal cost. Basically, the tone was, it is your duty to deliver for the company. And you have to be on time and you have to be on budget. So that's what we did. But we didn't outperform the plan, we just met it. And worse, by the end of the project, the team leaders were exhausted and just wanted to get back to their business as usual jobs. They felt a great sense of relief that the project was over, but no one felt like they were a winner. Second project, we really turned things around. Our rallying cry was lose no customers. A big issue in a large merger is client attrition, and it can, if it's not managed well, it can absolutely kill the economic models. It's an outwardly focused measure that everyone can rally around. And the team leaders and I knew that if we could have happy, loyal customers, we'd gain and keep #1 market share. And in fact, to this day, 10 years later, the company still has #1 market share. The culture we pushed was project success through personal success. We picked the best and the brightest to be the team leaders and assured them they would be safe. Not only would they not have to worry about losing their jobs, but I would give them the exposure and opportunities to make this project a real career accelerator. They were motivated to excel, and they did. In the first project, the motivation was really minimize the pain. In the second, it was to win and to win big. Another of my failures in the first project, and one of my biggest learnings, was overall management approach. In the first project, I set up a program management office, a PMO, that lorded over the team leaders and managed every detail on a top-down basis. I told those team leaders what to do and how to do it. I'd call them to account if they missed a deliverable or a deadline. Saying it now, it sounds kind of terrible, but at the time, it was a conventional way to run a big project in a big company. Maybe not very enlightened way, but the generally accepted way. Learning from that, we took a different approach in the second project. I was driven by the realization that what I did before just wouldn't work in a project that was an order of magnitude bigger. You just can't manage all those details in a top-down way. So the second time, I gave the program management office, the PMO, the job of supporting the team leaders, not beating them up. I was explicit with the PMO that if a team missed its goals, it was the PMO's fault for not recognizing that they were struggling and not getting them the help they needed to succeed. And rather than telling teams what to do and how to do it, I focused on clarifying outcomes, business outcomes, and then encouraging the teams to use their own creativity, experience, and skills to beat their targets. In line with that management approach, I gave the team leaders the opportunity to showcase their work. At regular intervals, I held stage gate presentations. This is where the teams would present to C-suite executives, the CEO, the CFO, and others about their progress and how they were moving forward in the integration. It had a really good management benefit in that it kind of kept the teams going together on a similar timeline. But as importantly, it let each team leader show their progress and their accomplishments. And before these presentations, the PMO and I worked with each of them, helping them to prepare and helping to address any weaknesses before the presentations. The team leaders were motivated to distinguish themselves by exceeding their goals. My job was to help them do that. There were other learnings as well. One was the realization that a project that big and that complicated, the only way to make the project a success was to make the team leaders a success. And the key to that was giving them goals based on outcomes like return on investment, like client retention, like revenue growth, not just a budget. You can beat a business outcome like return on investment or revenue growth by doing more and creating more value. The only way you can beat a budget goal is by spending less. In the end, I beat our goals. I mentioned we exceeded our revenue synergies by $120 million. We hit our integration timelines for major efforts like merging the bank entities and all that kind of good stuff. But at the end of the day, in some ways, what I'm most proud of from the project is that nearly all the integration team leaders became members of the operating committee. The operating committee was the top 175 executives across the 40,000 employees in the company around the world. So that's the top 0.4% of the executive team in the company. So we really were able to deliver on the promise to the integration heads that they would be successful and that success would propel their career. So, lesson learned. Set the right measures based on business outcomes, not on inputs. Changing gears now to personal failures I've observed. Through projects like the last two I just described, but particularly in the ensuing years heading corporate strategy for 3 different CEOs, I had the privilege of being part of some amazing executive teams. These executives were leaders in their industries and some of the best and brightest people I'd ever known. Their career success exceeded most people's wildest dreams, but not even they were immune from failure. Many of them lamented the lack of connection to their teenage and adult children. As they grew, family vacations faded away. The kids now just wanted spring break with college classmates. Summer weekends at the beach house used to be family affairs. Now the beach house was little more than an Airbnb, a place for the kids to crash between day trips with buddies or nights out. And it wasn't just vacations and summers. As soon as the kids got their driver's license, family time evaporated. The kids would rather be hanging out with their friends. It wasn't universally true, for sure, but a disproportionate number of the executives I admired so much professionally were somewhat less successful in their family lives. And that's both men and women, by the way. Of course, each situation was different. Career pressures were almost always a factor. Sometimes a divorce or a family tragedy accelerated parents and children drifting apart. But one thing they all had in common was that by the time they realized it, it was too late to do anything about it. Wistful stares at the family portraits on the desk couldn't close the separation. My gosh, I thought. If this happened to executives as smart and capable as these people, what chance do I have? Well, putting my scientist hat on, my original background is chemistry and physics, I hypothesized that in today's world, with all its distractions and everything competing for our time and attention, drifting apart just happens. It's kind of like entropy. It's the inevitable path. Inevitable, that is, unless you do something about it. I believe you can do something about it. My experience is that if you proactively create family memories, those shared experiences will create family bonds that last. But it has to be intentional, and it has to be done before it's too late. My wife and I resolved not to suffer that same fate. Starting with our 3 children when they were in grade school, we worked together to create shared family memories. As an example, we can take a family vacation, a trip to Disney World in particular. Most of us have done a Disney trip with kids, many of us more than one. Our first trip to Disney with the kids was fun, and we hope they had good memories. But hope isn't a plan. For our second trip, we changed things around. We actually didn't tell the kids we were going. We just got them up early one morning and said, "We're driving Dad to the airport for a business trip." When we got to the airport, I turned to the back seat and said, "Hey, rather than going on this business trip, how about we all go to Disney World instead?" They all laughed, "Sure, of course," but they didn't believe me. Even when I pulled out the suitcases my wife and I had secretly packed the night before, they weren't convinced. It wasn't until we were on the plane, pulling back from the gate, that they actually believed we were going. To this day, each of them remembers me turning and asking, "Want to go to Disney?" They remember it as if it was yesterday. But it's not just big things like family vacations. It's the day-to-day as well. Take family dinner. We proactively planned family dinners. Not every night, for sure. My wife is a successful attorney and I traveled all the time for work, so every night wasn't a practical reality. But at least a couple times a week, we made sure we had family dinner around the table. No TV, no phones, no Game Boys, just grown-up conversation. And we always made a point of talking with our children like adults, not down to them. And we didn't make separate kids' food either. If dinner was leg of lamb, everyone had leg of lamb. We made it a shared common experience. Now, our rule was you don't have to eat it, but you do have to at least try it. But to this day, dinner together is a big deal in our family. Our children are adults now. They're in Boulder, Colorado, New York City, Austin, Texas. But whenever we're together, we make a point to have a family dinner and renew those bonds. So, science guy, you ask, what proof do you have that your hypothesis that proactively creating family memories and shared experiences keeps a family together? Well, what else would a scientist do but conduct an experiment? I asked my kids. You see, every Sunday we Skype together for an hour or more. And usually it's one of the kids who sends the first text message early Sunday morning, "Hey, what time are we Skyping today?" So knowing I was giving this talk tonight, this past Sunday, I asked them, "Do you guys remember the Disney trip when we didn't tell you we were going?" Excitedly, each recounted that morning in detail. My one daughter even volunteered, "I even remember as the plane was pulling back, Dad, when you asked me, 'Do you believe me now?'" Following up, I asked them, "Do you remember what we did in Disney World on that trip?" There were only vague memories, and they actually couldn't really remember which of the 2 Disney trips they were from. It seems just hoping for fond memories doesn't work, but proactively creating them does. Then, I confess I led the witness a bit, and I said, "Would you agree that proactively creating family memories, that we proactively created family memories and that has helped us to be so close?" Not only did they readily agree, but the conversation turned, completely unprompted by me, to family dinners, family game nights, and other shared memories. That's good enough proof for me. Proactively create shared family memories before it's too late. In closing, in both our professional and personal lives, failures happen. I've failed a bunch of times, and I'm sure I'm going to fail a bunch more. In some ways, I think failure is like risk in that it's something that you need to manage, not something that is eliminated. But unlike risk, failure, whether experienced or observed, can be a powerful teacher. Thank you.
Yeah, there's one thing I forgot. That was great, Barrie. Let's give him a big applause.
Oh, thanks.
one thing I forgot to mention is that unlike TED Talks, we do allow Q&A in this session. So you're free to ask any question, and hopefully Barry can answer those. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for that talk. In the first, in your professional examples, the second example, the multi-billion-dollar
Yeah.
project that you worked on.
Yes.
It sounds like the way that you presented, there's a little bit of hindsight is 20/20, but there must have been some incredible forecasting that you did to justify working on outcomes versus just monitoring the budget. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because the initial corporate immune system response, it goes to detailed budgets and trying to control spending, right? We were really lucky in that we had a CEO who was very focused on outcomes and clients. And he had been through some large financial services mergers in the past himself and had some of the similar sorts of experiences. And it was enough to help us push and bridge that gap. I think had it not been for that CEO, we wouldn't. Had the decision been entirely up to our CFO, it definitely wouldn't have been that way. But the other part of it too was by picking the best and the brightest to be the heads of the different integration teams, they quickly gained the trust of the senior executive. And that made a big difference as well. So setting them up to look really good from the start really built a ton of credibility and a ton of goodwill, and that allowed us to flex in ways that we probably wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Yes?
I'm Thomas Vogt. I'm Thomas Vogt, and I'm a retired Siemens executive. I was always lucky in front of innovation. And I'm here now, 20 years in Pittsburgh, and try still to change the world. And my question is, so I'm struggling a little bit, how would you teach the executives today to see not only quarter results, to see a long-term change, especially in healthcare where we are spending trillions of dollars and nothing changed?
It's a fantastic question, and candidly, as a sort of corporate strategy guy, I think it's one of the basic fundamental challenges that American public companies have today. The pressure to deliver quarterly results is just crushing. And the tolerance for longer term returns is pretty low. You know, it's exacerbated by the average term of a CEO in a Fortune 250 company is remarkably short. So it's less than the average member of Congress. So you don't even if you're able to have that vision and communicate it, it's really hard. I think there are some companies that are sort of basically saying, if you're an investor, either you believe in me or you don't. But that's a pretty challenging move to make. I wish I had a good answer for you. It's something that in the corporate strategy community, people talk about all the time, but it's kind of weapons of mass discussion. Nothing ever really gets done, and I wish I had a good answer for it. If I did, I'd probably be playing bridge with Warren Buffett rather than here. Okay.
Any other questions?
Great.
I have a question. Oh, no.
Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, as a young professional, what would you recommend someone who is a young professional and maybe wants to be a CEO one day?
I think I would say, is that really what you want to be? Why?
Not a nonprofit CEO, that's for sure.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I'm only being partly facetious. It's job titles per se don't mean as much anymore. I think career paths aren't like they used to be. So work somewhere and climbing a corporate ladder for many years is I think not an ideal and sustainable career path going forward. I think the thing to do, for me anyway, more, I'm probably not a good person to ask because I never planned my career. Where I ended up just happened to be the beach I washed up on last time. But the one thing I always did do was try to do more and try to contribute and try to move forward. So I used to talk to interns when they come in and start at the company. And they were always wondering, what do I do here in the company to build my career? And I would say there's a couple things. The first is, in my view, the most powerful tool you have to build your career is your right hand. Raise it and volunteer. And not for the fun things like the bake sale. Those are all great. But like, what's the really hardest, stickiest, nastiest problem the company's facing right now? How can I help? And in doing that, get a reputation for executing well in a way that enhances the careers and the work of those around you and in a way that doesn't break glass. If you can do those two things, you'll do well. I used to think, particularly coming from a strategy background, that like senior executives spent all their time talking about all these deep strategy things. No, Most of their conversations are around people. Hey, we got that office in Milan, it blew up, the regulators are all over us, who can we send there to fix it? The conversations are about who, more often than not. So if you're one of those people who has a really good reputation for taking on difficult problems, getting them done without breaking glass, and doing them in a way that really is respectful and enhancing to your colleagues, I think that's about as good as you can do. Yes.
When you talk about getting the best and the brightest to kind of lead the PMO on the second project, do you think because they were the best and the brightest, that they already had it in their mind that the outcome is what I'm really striving for? Eventually, I want the outcome to be successful in various measures of his success. And do you think that's in turn why?
It certainly contributed, for sure, no doubt about it. So there was some selection bias there. And so they were positively predisposed to that, but you still had to create an environment where they could do it. And the traditional corporate environment makes it really hard for someone to do that, and it can make it personally risky to do it. And so yes, it helped a tremendous amount. And if we didn't have the best and the brightest, and they didn't have that skill set, it may not have worked out as well. It certainly would have been a heck of a lot harder if it hadn't. The other part too is being mindful. A lot of these corporate projects become dumping grounds for people whose careers have stalled. So you go to the head of a business and you say, hey, we need someone to represent your business on this project. And they're like, oh, that Barrie guy, he just kind of takes up space. This is a good way to kind of move him out of my group and get on. So it reinforces your point that picking the right people in those team lead roles is really a critical success factor.
So Barrie, you actually just answered half of my question regarding the best and the brightest, because my question was originally going to be, if in fact that was the basis for your success there, then does that by corollary mean that every other project they don't bother or don't try to get the best and the brightest? But I guess if we take that a step further with what you just said, now how often does it happen in that type of scenario, in the corporate scenario, where the best and the brightest are picked versus those that aren't? So how big a problem is it that may not be the case if in fact that's not the case?
Yeah, my observation is it's changed pretty dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. There's in large corporations, there is so much continuing pressure to reduce headcount. Combine that with the fact that an A player is about 10 times as productive as a C player. It really forces a manager's hand. I'm not a big believer in programs where it's like, okay, the bottom 10% have to be let go every year. I think that's a blunt force tool. But I think proactively managing that talent becomes really critical. And there's some good studies that show the firms that do that well outperform. Yeah.
Thanks, Barrie, for a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
Especially in the two aspects. One is professional and the second part is personal. and I think we have something to learn in both the aspects. My question to you is, as Veridog Global, my company is into document verification, and in the East we have a lot of traction and success, and we are entering into the US market. Now when you say document verification, starting from a very small company to big force, everybody needs documents to be verified, audited, and
Sure.
everything. What do you think what should be my approach? Go for the small one, big one, education, medical, or everything?
I'd start by saying, as an entrepreneur, how do you personally define success? And your vision of that. We do that with the firms we have in our incubator here and that we coach. So we don't have a set program that says, okay, this is a 12-week program. Week 2, everybody's going to be doing a business model canvas. Week 3, everyone's going to be refining their financial model. It starts off with really sort of introspection on the founder's part on why are you doing this? How are you defining success? If you aren't clear about that, it's the old Yogi Berra line, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. It's almost like destination planning. What is that destination? And then work your way backwards from that. Good. Okay. Yes. There is a 2-question limit. I have to tell you that. So this is your last one. Yeah.
To follow on your the idea of failure. I just took a course on governance and cooperatives, and a lot of the course was actually at the University of Saskatchewan. It's an excellent course. One of the things that it had to do was it had to teach by example, and one of the examples they had of corporate governance in traditional companies is Arthur Andersen, and how basically the founders and their ideals were traded away for the consultancy component of Arthur Andersen.
Yep.
And that seemed like a question of governance, of the board deciding to ignore what the founders' ideals were. Do you think that some of the things that you mentioned about the short-term thinking of modern corporations has something to do with corporate governance? And do you have any thoughts on changes that could be made?
No, it's a good question. I think there's a couple things came together in that time period. And it was right after that all the large accounting firms were forced to divest their consulting business. So I was at Ernst & Young then, and all our consulting business went to Capgemini. There were a couple things. A CPA and a management consultant have fundamentally different measures of success. And the governance part where I think things fell down a bit was not having the right systems aligned to those measures. So, you're in an environment where, particularly in a lot of those sorts of roles, people act in their self-interest. So, if I can find ways that are within the system to do something, I'll do that. Governance. In a lot of those cases, there's that whole systems alignment part to it too, but in a lot of cases, it's culture. You can't create rules for everything, and I mean, if you did, then it's a big book. It's impossible for anyone to know it, even, right? So Wells Fargo is an example that many would say was not because what employees did was condoned or sanctioned by the company. It was a cultural issue. And I think it's, from a governance perspective, yeah, there's certain things you need to do and certain controls you have in place. But at the end of the day, if it's a large organization, an Arthur Andersen with over 100,000 employees, you can't, it gets to the point I was making about having the project be a success by making the team leaders a success. You have to create the environment where they can succeed and put in the systems and the rewards and the motivations that they're doing the right thing, and surround it with a really strong culture. I think rules-based approaches are just really challenging. Yes?
To jump off of that, I think we all have our own biases could be related to our upbringing, where we've worked, even our personality types. And so when we're creating a culture, you're working with different types of people with all different combinations of experiences and personalities. And so how do you manage that and keep yourself in check as you're trying to build this culture? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question too. Look, it takes a lot of conscious effort, but it also takes understanding there's a difference between an individual's culture based on their heritage or their background or their experience and the shared culture you're trying to create in an organization. And you need to understand, appreciate, and celebrate the different cultural backgrounds that the people have. That's an important part of diversity, is understanding and celebrating those differences. But at the same time, if you're going to have a strong organization, there have to be common cultural elements that people share. You flex because people are different, but you need to think about those as somewhat distinct things. Yes.
I'm interested in the transition you made from, Fortune 500 companies to running this nonprofit startup space here in Pittsburgh. What would you say is the biggest surprise?
Probably the biggest surprise is that fundamentally a lot of the issues are exactly the same. It's just the scale that's different. We're here at Ascender, we're still, what's our strategy? How do we get everything in the organization aligned to it? How do we have the best talent we can get? How do we constantly check ourselves and say, are we delivering the outcomes we're delivering? Another part that is more the same than I thought it might be, candidly, is the idea of competition. For-profit companies compete with each other for a certain profit pool. The nature of the competition in a nonprofit, there's a lot of competition, but it's different in nature, and in some ways it's more complex. So if I'm running a for-profit corporation, I'm concerned about my customers and what their needs are, and if I satisfy those needs, they're happy, I'm happy, I make money, they get what they need. In a nonprofit, the person you're serving is different than the person who's funding you. So it's not the customer paying you the revenue, it's another revenue source. So you've got to serve both of those well. And the nature of the competition to me isn't I'm going to raise more money. I'm going to raise money and take it away from another nonprofit. To me, it's more fundamental in that those who are funding us, we have, I think, a fiduciary duty to get the greatest return and have the highest impact vis-a-vis our mission for the funds we have to do that. So it's actually in some ways a harder, more complicated type of competition. And that, honestly, I wasn't expecting. Yeah. Okay. No? All right.
What is something that corporations can learn from nonprofits and the other way around?
I think you're seeing a lot in the corporate world, more and more of an honest look at purpose-driven innovation and corporate and social responsibility in a meaningful way, not just hey, I need some pretty pictures of employees in the company t-shirt volunteering at a soup kitchen. But really, thinking about how within their mission purpose-driven innovation fits and what role they want to play in society. That's never going to be the dominant role of a corporation. That's not what they're there for. But I think they're doing it, and they're learning that from the sort of the best of breed nonprofits. For nonprofits, the flip is to really be focused on business outcomes in a sense. So, if you look at grant requests to foundations as an example from years past, they were mostly driven by activities. Here are the things we're going to do. We're going to open this education center. We're going to clean this park. And the foundation started saying, but that's just an activity. It's kind of like talking about a budget's just an input. What are you trying to drive? So the shift then progressed to looking at what outputs are you going to generate. So, we're going to open the education center, that's an activity. The output is we're going to have 1,500 kids go through this educational program. That's a step in the right direction. But really what you need is outcomes. How is that educational program going to affect the arc of that child's life? And that's the big shift in nonprofits and philanthropy generally now. And it's, you know, it's come from those two worlds kind of coming together. And I think it's going to lead to really, you know, really good, effective results. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. It was great to have you here. And thank you, Prashant.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Very strong messages and good story as well. So Barry, one last question for you.
Yep.
What are you doing differently now at Ascender to make it more successful? Not that it was not successful before, but I'm sure your strategy, you put a lot of thought in it now. So what is different? What are we going to see that's different?
Yeah, I'd say that the primary difference is a much tighter focus on our mission, and really looking at all our activities and all our efforts, and saying, does this really help Pittsburgh region entrepreneurs be more successful? Are we helping to create more Pittsburgh region entrepreneurs? And using that as a test, kind of going back to the question of, you know, what outputs are we trying to generate as opposed to just what activities? And, you know, a prime example of that is probably Thrival, where we looked at, the team did a great job this year really looking at it long and hard and saying, you know, it's kind of drifted away from the mission. It's a really cool event, it's a fun festival, you know, everyone has a great time. But getting back to that, having a fiduciary responsibility to deliver against, you know, what your funders are asking you to do, I think, you know, changes like that are probably the main parts. I think it's a fantastic organization. It's got a great team. It's done a ton of good work. It's got a good, you know, reputation in the community. The foundation is there. I think it's just how do you take all that capability and that position and that value and really make sure you're delivering as well as you can against your mission.
Great. Thank you. One more applause for the